Yeah, this is John Byler. I'm going to be reading from a book by Stanley Jones called The Way, and it's daily meditations. And I'm going to start with the back cover. It says, The Road That Leads to Life. And it says, the way to live, according to Stanley Jones, is woven into the nature of reality and stamped within us. It is not merely written in books. It is written into our very makeup. It is not only written in texts of scriptures, but in the texture of our beings. Each daily entry builds on the one before and describes the two roads we all can travel. The way God intended us to live does not deprive us of enjoyment. It gives us the satisfaction of being all we were created to be. Updated for the 21st century by noted editor Dean Merrill, this dynamic daily devotional is making a long-deserved comeback. And then a brief bio of the author on the back. Stanley Jones, 1884 to 1973, was a man ahead of his time. In 1938, Time magazine called him the world's greatest missionary. His message presented Christianity as a faith with global appeal. Standing room only crowds filled his meeting halls on 4 different continents. He is reported to have preached some 60,000 times, perhaps a world record. Listeners came to Christ on nearly every occasion. He advised U.S. presidents as well as Indian leaders and was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. The author of 28 books, he wrote 10 full-year devotionals, some of which became million-copy bestsellers. And I'm opening up the front page and the table of contents, and we begin with about a page called A Man Ahead of His Time. Stanley Jones, 1884 to 1973, was a Methodist missionary to India during the colonial period. His prolific writing and speaking brought God's truth in fresh ways to audiences, both Eastern and Western, often challenging their assumptions and stretching their souls. Born in Maryland, Jones first arrived in India in 1907 and was assigned to an English-speaking congregation in the city of Lucknow. But he soon showed a gift for connecting with the wider Indian culture, particularly the educated castes. He was a keen student of Hindu and Muslim mindsets, and he carried a deep passion that Christianity not present itself as a Western import. In a sense, he was seeker-sensitive, at least 70 years before North Americans invented the label. In 1930, he founded his first ashram, a place for spiritual retreat that fit the Indian tradition but led many to consider the person of Christ. No doubt, the richness of his devotional writing sprang in part from the times he spent there in reflection before God. A good friend of Mahatma Gandhi, even when they disagreed, Jones spoke out for peace, justice, and racial harmony. He saw clearly that the British rule of this massive nation would have to cease, and said so with enough cogency that the British pulled his visa for 6 years. A widely sought speaker in his day, Stanley Jones wrote 28 books in all, the best known of which was The Christ of the Indian Road, 1925. In 1938, Time magazine called him the world's greatest Christian missionary. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1962 and received the Gandhi Peace Award the next year. Yet he never compromised his message. This is a quote now. "The straightforward, open proclamation of Jesus is the best method," he wrote with all sincerity. "Jesus appeals to the soul as light appeals to the eye, as truth fits the conscience, as beauty speaks to the aesthetic nature. For Christ and the soul are made for one another. But the Hindu insists, and rightly so, that it must not be an encrusted Christ. It must not be a Christ bound with the grave clothes of long-buried doctrinal controversy, but a Christ as fresh and living and as untrammeled as the one that greeted Mary at the empty tomb." In this book, re-edited for the 21st century, that Christ becomes real and vibrant again through the insights of a man who was, in more than one way, ahead of his time. And then before we get into the first devotional, there's another page and a half called "The Way versus Not the Way." God's way to live, is it something pushed upon us from above, the command of a high and authoritarian deity determined to get us to shape up? Not at all, says E. Stanley Jones. Quote, "When God made you and me and the universe, he stamped within us a way," he writes in his preface. "It is a part of us. The way to live is not merely written in sacred books, but it is also written into our blood, our nerves, our tissues, our organs. It is not only written in texts of scriptures, but in the texture of our beings. It is not imposed, but exposed from our very makeup." Hence, Jones speaks winsomely about two roads we all can travel, the way and not the way. Those beliefs and behaviors that are not the way seem to implicate themselves whether they want to or not. Meanwhile, the way confirms its value in 1,000 different evidences. No wonder the author, when asked to choose which of his many books was his favorite, said, "If I would like to leave one particular message to posterity, it would be the message of the way." Throughout this book, you will notice its setting, the early months and years after World War II. Jones was free to travel far and wide for speaking engagements. Latin America is mentioned a number of times, which means he was writing in planes, trains, hotels, and any number of other momentary settings. But the horrors of war, especially nuclear war, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were still fresh in his memory. He was more convinced than ever that human attempts at peace and wholeness are not enough. We need divine wisdom and power. Like the devotional books that preceded this one, Victorious Living and Abundant Living, this book usually spends a week on a given theme, developing it in depth, and the themes progress throughout the year in a sequential, logical manner. What this means is that we don't end each day's reading with a pretty bow tying up the package. We are rather being drawn along a trail, day after day, that takes us deeper and further into spiritual understanding. If we don't sense a hurrah or an applause line at the bottom of every page, that is because Jones was not aiming for such a response. He meant instead to make more solid Christians out of us. The Bible selections printed at the start of each day's reading in this edition are almost always the ones Jones chose himself. He frequently opted for the freshness and color of a certain translation that was popular in his day, by the Scottish scholar James Moffat. That text is preserved here. Whether this book is used by an individual, a couple, a family with children, a Bible study group, or a larger class or congregation, the impact will be to draw users toward the road for which they were created. As the October 22 reading says, the Christian way is the sensible way to live now. There is more joy to the square inch in Christ than in a square mile outside.